Hi, and welcome to Trust and Obey. My name is Chuck Frank, and this is our study of the book of Esther. And today we are studying chapter 6, high stakes and high drama. So when we left Esther, she had had one private banquet in her chambers for her husband, King Ahasuerus and Haman. And King Ahasuerus is very curious why Esther would have risked her life to come into his throne room unannounced, uninvited. And he could see that she was pretty upset. And he asked her what was wrong and what it was she wanted. And she said, I just want you and Haman to come to a luncheon in my chambers. So he said, okay. And he said, somebody find Haman and let's hurry up. I get the sense that King Ahasuerus knows there's something wrong and he wants to find out what it is. So they go and they have the lunch, and he immediately, before the food's even served, is saying, okay, my queen, what's the deal? Why would you risk your life? It's certainly not so that we could have a luncheon. And Esther says, what I would like is to have you to another luncheon. So my suspicion is that he thinks something is really up. So much so that she's afraid to say it. And so he says, okay, Haman and I will come tomorrow to another luncheon. So during the night, all this stuff is on the king's mind and he can't sleep. And that's where we pick up the action. And that's where we see a scene where God's providential hand times a factor of 10 is just playing everybody in this thing like a Stradivarius. So the king plans to honor Mordecai. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written what Mordecai had reported about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to attack King Ahasuerus. So, two issues of God's providential hand. One is the king can't sleep, so he asks for the records, the chronicles of his kingdom, to read through what's been going on. And his eunuch just happens to turn to this section about Mordecai saving his life by telling Esther that the two eunuchs that guard his bedroom door were going to kill him. Let's proceed. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the courtyard? Now Haman had just entered the outer courtyard of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the wooden gallows which he had prepared for him. More evidence of God's providence here, his providential hand, that the king sees, you know what? This guy saved my life and nobody did anything for him. And who was in a position to do something for him? The prime minister, Haman. He should have reviewed the books. He should have seen this, and he should have said, oh my gosh, this guy saved your life. We really have to honor him. Instead, nothing had been done. So as far as the king's concerned, that means saving the king's life is not a high priority. And then he says, who's in the courtyard? Haman is, and Haman is coming to ask if he can hang Mordecai, and the king is trying to find out why Mordecai wasn't honored. So the king's servant said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard. And the king said, have him come in. So the king's got some suspicions. And this is a rendition of the king going through the record, the long scroll of the record in the middle of the night, something he would probably never do, but because of God's providential hand, he's right at the point of the Mordecai story. Haman then came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? Now, that's not the way he would have approached Haman ordinarily. They had just had this lovely lunch together hours before. Why so cagey? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Therefore Haman said to the king, for the man who the king desires to honor, have them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal turban has been placed. Then order them to hand the robe and the horse over to one of the king's noble officials, and have them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, so it shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor. So, a lot going on here, like a 3D chess play is going on here. First of all, the king is thinking, maybe this Haman guy has designs on my throne. Maybe that's why he didn't honor Mordecai. And then Haman comes in, and he gets this strange question from the king. What is to be done for the man who the king desires to honor? And Haman, because he has a hardened heart and he is full of himself, he thinks, well, the king, he's definitely talking about me. And so he describes to the king that this guy should be dressed up in all the king's best stuff, and then walked through the city looking exactly like the king. Now, this would have taken Ahasuerus' paranoia level to crazy heights. And Haman thinks the whole time that this is all befitting of him. And he says, so it shall be done for the man who the king desires to honor. Let's see how much the king desires to honor. Here we got, our God has a devilly sense of humor. He sure does. He is setting this guy up so bad. But this guy's murderous. He's genocidal. And he deserves what's coming. Then the king said to Haman, quickly, take the robe and the horse, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. Can you imagine Haman's mainframe brain, that narcissistic personality, crashing as soon as he hears this? Do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fail to do anything of all that you have said. That's the ringer right there. All those things you described, all those things you thought were going to be for you, making you look like the king, sending my paranoia meter all the way to the red. So Haman took the robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, so it shall be done for the man who the king desires to honor. Now, everybody in Shushan knew about the feud between Haman and Mordecai. They also knew that Haman was the one who concocted this genocidal law against the Jews. And now they see his archenemy, Mordecai, dressed like the king, and Haman is walking him around the city, proclaiming, "So it shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Now, these people weren't stupid. They understood that the Jews had this incredible relationship with one God who intervened for them. And they would have seen Mordecai dressed in all the king's regalia on his horse, being walked around by Haman, and said, "Oh, wow, the God of the Hebrews he is going overboard right now to make a point." So here's a depiction, not so royal, would have been much fancier than this, but you get the mood. You get the mood because Haman is looking downcast and Mordecai is trying to get his king stature up. Haman leads Mordecai on horseback. This is a very, very common Robin Hood England look to everything. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate while Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. Now he's mourning because he knows the king has shamed him, right? He made a spectacle of him. And so he covers his head so nobody will recognize him. I'm sure that didn't work. And his mind must be racing because there's no way he can continue to be the prime minister after being humiliated like this. So he gets home and he goes, and Haman informs Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends of everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not prevail over him, but will certainly fall before him." Nice friends and wife, right? Just telling him, you are toast. They all know Mordecai's a Jew. And they know that in less than 24 hours, this guy went from being in a private luncheon invited by the queen for him and the king and the queen to leading Mordecai through the city, walking a horse with Mordecai and the king's regalia. I mean, there's no place in history where we see somebody go from prime minister who thinks he's going to be king one day to basically heading to the gallows on the same day. So while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly brought Haman to the banquet with Esther, which Esther had prepared. Now, why would they do that? Because the king is saying, I don't want this guy to run away. I don't know if he really knows how ripped I am. And we don't know if the king and Esther had a conversation. But they're making sure that Haman's going to show up. And Haman and his wife and his friends must have thought, this is really bad. So here's Haman seeking help from his advisors. And you can tell from their look, they're all like, there's no help for you, guy. You're done. You are totally, totally done. All right. And we're done. We're just going to have a closing prayer, a word of prayer, and we're going to read a psalm as our prayer, a psalm of David. And David titled this psalm, Prayer for Deliverance from Evil Men. Deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Preserve me from violent men who plan evil things in their hearts. They continually gather together for war. They sharpen their tongues like a serpent. The poison of asps is under their lips. Selah. Keep me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Preserve me from violent men who have purpose to make my steps stumble. The proud have hidden a snare for me and cords. They have spread a net by the wayside. They have set traps for me. Selah. I said to the Lord, "You are my God. Hear the voice of my supplications, O Lord." O God, the Lord, the strength of my salvation, you have covered my head in the day of battle. Do not grant, O Lord, the desires of the wicked. Do not further his wicked scheme, lest they be exalted. Selah. As for the head of those who surround me, let the evil of their lips cover them. Let burning coals fall upon them. Let them cast into the fire, into deep pits, that they rise not up again. Let not a slanderer be established in the earth. Let evil hunt the violent man to overthrow him. I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. Surely the righteous shall give thanks to your name. The upright shall dwell in your presence. Thank you again for studying this 6th chapter of Esther, a chapter which shows over and over again God's providential hand prevailing over evil men seeking power, whose heart God has hardened. God bless you, and thanks for joining us.